At its core, Genshin Impact is a game about elements and elemental reactions. They are the fundamentals the entire combat system is built around. If you go to the official website and check out the page about game features, one of the first things you'll see is a blurb telling you to master the 7 elements, saying that Genshin isn't just another mindless hack and slash. This is actually pretty funny since it still said this back before Sumeru came out, when the game only had 6 elements. However, there was another pseudo element to play around with. While there were only 6 elements at launch, there were 7 damage types. Enter physical. Physical damage is Genshin's form of non-elemental damage. Hit someone with a sword, it's physical damage. Pretty simple. Physical has always been a weird part of the game. For a while, it was a decent damage type with at least one phenomenal DPS to represent it. But as time has gone on, and especially after Dendro actually got added in, it's been completely left in the dust. These days, physical is far and away the worst damage type, and it's not even remotely close. But why? How did it end up here? Why have the devs neglected it? It doesn't have a chance to become good again. I'm going to answer these questions, teach you everything there is to know about physical, and look a bit into the design philosophy of the game in the process. This is a complete analysis of physical damage in Genshin, and how to fix it. Also, thank you so much for 1,000 subs, it genuinely means so much to me. Let's start with the core aspect of damage type in Genshin, elemental reactions. While physical, not being an element, can't trigger usual reactions, there are a few it can relate back to. Before we look at those, let's look at reactions as a concept. Elemental reactions define Genshin's combat. Most teams are built around maximizing the potential of a single reaction, and a lot of the best characters are designed around the same thing. Vaporize, Melt, Hyper Bloom, Overloaded, phenomenal boost to damage that are essentially the only way of keeping up with floor 12 enemies. Not every element gets an equal distribution of reactions, however. While Hydro sits nearly uncontested with Bloom, Vaporize, Freeze, and Electro Charge, we also have Geo. Geo is the closest damage type to physical, both in mechanics and in viability, so expect a lot of comparisons. Geo is an element with a single reaction to its name, Crystallize. And if you don't know anything about Crystallize, you should know that it is really bad. Crystallize doesn't do any extra damage when it procs, and will instead create a shield that absorbs damage based on the Geo character's elemental mastery. Not only is the shield extremely underwhelming, but most Geo characters already have a way of making their own shields, so it's rarely ever a beneficial reaction to build around. The only character who actually takes advantage of Crystallize does so by completely ignoring its main effects, which is actually really funny. So to recap, Geo's a mediocre element with a terrible reaction, but it has one. Keep this in mind as we go back to our main topic. Physical has 2 reactions related to it, and they're both problematic for their own reasons. Let's start with the less relevant of the two, Shatter. Shatter is... I don't even know, man, it's so weird. Shatter is one of the 3 multi-tiered reactions in the game, requiring you to trigger a different reaction as set up for it. I guess Spread and Aggravate also count towards this, but I consider them and Quicken as part of the same thing. You don't really need to build a team around one. Now, the other reactions that share this property, Burgeon and Hyper Bloom, are extremely strong, and are a good reward for other setup. You need to proc Bloom, then hit the cores with either Pyro or Electro, and the core will explode or fly towards a foe. The reactions are quick, they feel good to use, and it makes for a nice and coherent team that's fun to play. Plus, they have the highest reaction multiplier in the game, so they hit ridiculously hard. This is basically the only trait they share with Shatter. Shatter is triggered when you freeze an opponent, then hit them with a blunt attack, usually a greatsword. To cut to the chase, Shatter is pretty universally considered the worst reaction in the game, and it's not really hard to see why. Not only does it scale off EM, a stat most physical builds really don't want, it requires a frozen opponent. Just proccing freeze on them isn't good enough, which means it's literally impossible to use on bosses. Great. Even if it could work on them, I still don't think most people would use it, because it just feels super clunky to use. It's hard to describe, but Shatter feels extremely sluggish to actually do anything with. It feels like you have to focus so much on just trying to trigger the reaction, all for a mediocre burst of Phys damage. Even the character who saved Freeze from eternal irrelevance, Escoffier, didn't do a single thing to Shatter, just left it to rot. Ironically, the best Shatter character in the game isn't even a physical character, it's Kaveh. He's a greatsword who scales only off of EM, and always wants a Hydro character with him, so it's not hard to throw a Cryo Plier into a team with him. The result is a questionably viable but extremely fun Shatter Bloom comp that can result in some absolutely disgusting numbers. Though it is still worthless against bosses. That was a lot of discussion for a reaction that's barely relevant to the topic of the video, so let's get back on track. Physical, and everything about it, is truly defined by one reaction: Superconduct. Superconduct is fortunately much simpler than Shatter, just being the combination of cryo and electro. It's designed as a debuffing reaction, sort of like Swirl with Viridescent Venerer. It has low damage scaling, but when it triggers, it'll decrease the physical resistance of every enemy content's radius by a whopping 40%. Res Shred is a very common part of physical damage. Since Phys can't trigger reactions, a lot of its extra damage comes from straight damage buffs and Res Shred, and there's no larger source of that than Superconduct. It's the same debuffing potential as VV, but targeted toward Phys instead of the swirlable elements. Needless to say, this is a huge boost to Phys damage, and is what almost every team is built around. Even better, the debuff of Superconduct lasts for a really long time, 12 seconds. Even if your on-field character isn't triggering the reaction, that should be more than enough time for them to swap on, do their thing, and then switch back to support to get the cycle going again. It is the reaction for physical, and is exactly what you could want from a reactionless damage type. On paper, it's the perfect reaction. But there are issues. Quite a few of them. Firstly, the damage of Superconduct itself is really low. It's a multiplicative damage reaction with a multiplier of 1.5 times. That may sound pretty good, this puts it near the bottom of multiplicative reactions, only being beaten out by Swirl and Burning. Even Electrocharged has 2.0 times. This means that Superconduct is a reaction that's never worth building around for just its damage. The scaling is far too low to make a dedicated Superconduct team. It's reserved for physical support and nothing else. If you want something damaging, Overloaded has a similar AoE effect, still takes Electro, and has nearly double the multiplier. There's one other, very notable thing Overloaded has over Superconduct, and that's a dedicated character. In fact, almost every reaction has one. Ever since Eula dropped in 22, the devs have been adding in a bunch of characters built around making one particular reaction amazing. Eula has Bloom, then we got Chevreuse with Overloaded, Navia with Crystallize, the list goes on, especially with the recent addition of Lunar reactions. As of the time of writing this, almost every single reaction has a character dedicated to buffing or using it in some way, with some double or even triple dipping. And don't even get me started on Electrocharged. But while all of these healthy reactions have gotten new characters to help them stay relevant, there are a few that have been left on the sidelines. Catalyze, and of course, Superconduct. The reaction has gotten nothing new since the game's debut, bar a multiplier increase that applied to every reaction across the board. It's just stuck as the physical buffing reaction, and considering the state of Phys in the meta, that's really not where you want to be. The other core problems with Superconduct are less about it and more about physical damage, and the abundant problems it has. For starters, imagine if you will that you just got a new Pyro DPS. Wow, that's so cool. What kind of team are you gonna put them in? Obviously, Melt's always a great option, but if you're feeling frisky, you could go for Reverse Vape instead. If you got Chevreuse, Overloaded is a solid team comp, or if you got C6 Benny, there's always Mono Pyro. Hell, if you really want to try something fun, you could go for Burning, or maybe Burgeon if they don't attack that fast. Now, imagine you got a new physical DPS. What kind of team are you gonna put them in? Superconduct. Maybe Shatter. That's about it. The first real issue with physical is this weird circular relationship with Superconduct. The two greatly benefit each other's strengths, but they also rely way too heavily on each other. You can't have a Superconduct team without physical, and you can't have a physical team without Superconduct. And as long as one of them stays out of the meta, the other does too. In the current states of both of these, this leads to a more apparent issue of physical team comp. Nearly every Phys team is built in the exact same way. If you got your DPS, you're going to want an Electro Applier and a Cryo Applier. Your DPS is probably one already, but you'll want a second one for Resonance. Then, Bennett. Or if you already have Mika, I don't know, Albedo. Most every Phys team looks identical, because they only have one real choice to build around. It's not because Superconduct is a game-breaking option for their teams, it's because it's the only option. Speaking of limited options, I think it's time we move on to the next major section of the video. Characters. A damage type is only as good as the characters who wield it. Unfortunately, the roster of physical characters aren't exactly the most all-star cast around. To start with, let's see who we've got. For DPS characters, Eula. Descendant of Mondstadt's Lawrence clan, the face of physical damage, and inarguably the wielder of the best physical kit and hips in the game. Xinyan. Liyue's favorite rock musician, the first Pyro Shield, a strange DPS support hybrid, and my main. Freminet, proud member of the House of the Hearth, sibling of Linny and Lynette, and the only Shatter-focused character in the game. And, that's it. There are only 3 DPS characters in the game who are actually built around Phys. Compare this to any elemental damage. I can assure you they'll have at least twice that. It's pitiful. I want to look at all these characters in depth to see what they do and what makes them work, both as DPS characters and specifically as physical characters, to see what any future characters can take from them. There are a few other notable people who can work as Phys characters, but clearly aren't designed for it. I'll mention those as well, if not as examples for the designers, then as examples for you to have fun with. Let's get cracking. Ever since her inclusion in 1.5, Eula has become the representation of physical damage, being the first character fully built around it, and a really fun character to play. She's a cryo greatsword whose main mechanic lies in her burst. Upon casting it, a small sword will start to hover around her, which will gradually increase in size for every hit she lands on an enemy. After a set time, or when she switches off, the sword will plunge into the ground, exploding and dealing colossal physical damage to a large AoE. The scaling of this thing is crazy, with a minimum of 725% at level 10. For reference, that's just 75% short of Mavuika. That's before Eula even hits anything. To pair with this, she has a skill that can be pressed for some cryo damage and to gain 1 separate stack, and then held to release all those stacks, each of which will decrease the physical res of any foe she hits. Eula is a character with a lot of depth to her. Pre-charging her skill, then trying to mix it in with as many normal attacks as possible during her burst time is really fun. It takes a lot of skill. She's got an infinitely high skill ceiling, especially if you try increasing her attack speed. And with how hard her burst can hit, especially on a crit, it's not hard to see why she was considered a top tier DPS for a while. But on top of being a good character, she is the perfect framework for a physical character. She shreds res on her own, which as established, is one of the primary sources of damage bonuses. But she's also a great example of another unique boon of physical I haven't mentioned yet: scaling. Damage scaling is always an important part of a character's kit, and it's more important for physical characters than any other. Since they can't trigger reactions, every hit landed by a physical character should just hit harder than any element. Fortunately, there are parts of the game to help support this that you might not have noticed. Artifacts that directly boost the damage type, both the 2 pieces and the goblets, give substantially larger buffs to physical. Additionally, some weapons even have a physical damage substat. Ironically, these weapons are hardly ever worth using, since all the characters who could use them would just prefer a crit weapon, but they're still available. With all these options, it's hard not to get an absolutely crazy physical damage bonus. Paired with Superconduct, I'd imagine this was enough to make Phys at least a decently viable option back in the early days of the game, but with the current state of things, it's far from enough. Oh yeah, Eula. I bring up scaling because Eula's damage scaling, especially on her burst, is fantastic. To this day, she still holds the single highest scaling normal attack string, going past 1000% at level 10. Paired with Physical's naturally higher damage bonuses, it's enough to let her almost compete with some modern DPS characters with proper support. Eula is the face of Physical, and she represents it as well as she possibly can. She is the only character in the game to properly utilize all the benefits of the non-element. Her cryo perks, higher scalings, natural red shred, normal attack heavy playstyle, combo incentive, and screenshot worthy burst damage. Eula doesn't just represent Physical, Eula is Physical. To close the book on her, like I'm going to do with every other character I'm going to talk about, I want to list what Eula does right and wrong, as a physical character, as a Genshin character, and as a build investment. Fortunately, I've got almost nothing but positives for Eula. She's got tremendous scalings, a really fun burst to optimize, natural res shred, the right supporting element, and an incredibly fun and dynamic playstyle that stays interesting. The only downside she has is simply that she's tied to the worst damage type in the game. It's weird to point out in a video like this, but it does make her a little difficult to recommend as an investment right now. But unless you're trying to play 100% optimally with nothing but the hottest new meta characters, I'd completely recommend her. I actually got her by accident when I was trying to get Albedo from the first Chronicled Wish, but I have never been happier to lose 50-50 in my entire life. It is crazy to me that Xinyan predates Eula by a whole 4 versions, entering this stage all the way back in 1.1. Xinyan has always been a very unusual character. She was considered decent for about a month after her release, then fell right into the bottom of most people's tier lists. These days, she's considered one of, if not the single worst character in the game. Now, I'm a proud Xinyan main, and I have been for a while. I'd say I know a lot more about her than most people. That's not because I'm some sort of expert, it's because a lot of people don't actually know what she does, and so they just assume she's unusable trash. So, let me clear up some confusion. Xinyan is not the worst character in the game. Far from it. As long as people like these exist, she can't be. In fact, she's not even a bad character. Now, I'm not saying she's a good character, but she's at least like high C tier. I'd argue mid B, but I know I'm a little biased. Either way, she's an overhated character who offers a bizarre but effective kit. And let's break that down. Xinyan is a Pyro Claymore who functions as a DPS support hybrid, and can go either way based on how you want to build her. The game itself classifies her as a support character, so let's start with her support capabilities. Xinyan's skill produces a Pyro shield around her. Now, because this is Xinyan, it's more complicated than just pressing a button. Her shield has 3 different levels of strength, which are achieved based on the number of enemies hit with the initial casting. Different levels increase its HP, and at max, it'll periodically deal pyro damage in a circle around you. There are numerous problems with this shield. The multi-charge mechanic is interesting on paper, but is a serious hassle in actuality. The issue is that it feels completely outside of your control. You need to hit 2 enemies to get the highest level, which not only needs there to be 2 enemies to hit, but also needs them to be standing close enough together to get slammed by Xinyan's guitar. The hitbox is actually rather large, but if 2 enemies are on opposite sides of a room, that's not gonna matter. Additionally, there is a fundamental flaw with needing to run directly into a group of enemies to get a shield that protects you from enemy fire. Seems a bit counterintuitive. Diona has a similar multi-charge shield, but with 2 key differences. Her shield is entirely in the player's control. You can either press it or hold it, depending on what you need in this situation. And that's just the other thing. The 2 shield levels each have perks. The hold gives you a beefier shield that lasts longer and gives more particles, but the press version has a faster animation and a way shorter cooldown. With Xinyan's shield, there's the version that you want, and the other 2 that are bad and worse. Well, that implies that her strong shield is good itself, which unfortunately isn't true. For all the work you put in for the level 3 shield, it is amazingly unimpressive. Even with a well-built support Xinyan, it has some of the lowest health of any shield in the game. If you solely want a pyro shield with some off-field application, Toma is leagues better. Even with a huge defense investment, Xinyan still pales in comparison to the fixers. And speaking of, that's the last problem with Xinyan's shield. It scales off her defense. I don't know why. Every other part of her kit scales off of attack, as even her ascension stat. Up until C6, her shield is the only part of her entire kit that scales off defense, which makes her really weird to build. If you want her purely for her shield and its benefits, you want to go defense, which tanks her damage. But if you want to do damage, you'll invest in attack, which makes her shield extremely weak. I think this is the main reason people consider her so bad. Her split scaling basically forces her to pick one role to fill, and completely ignore half of her kit. I can't defend this, it's a stupid decision. There is no reason her shield couldn't scale off attack. It does nothing but mess up her builds and give her a bad reputation. So I just spent like 2 minutes talking about how bad Xinyan's shield is, but there's more to this story. All those downsides I talked about are what most people see her shield as, and I can't blame them. Those are the stats given in the skills description. But looking beyond that, there are some extra use cases for it. Firstly, her C2. Xinyan's C2 is the only constellation that benefits both her roles, and it's for totally different reasons. For support, it makes it so the casting her burst will instantly give her a level 3 shield, completely independent of its cooldown. This means that with enough ER, Xinyan theoretically has 100% uptime on her shield. At half the time, that's guaranteed to be the one that provides pyro application. Very helpful, but not quite as much as her A4 and C4. Remember when this video was about physical damage and not ranting about Xinyan's design? Well, this is where we get back on topic. Xinyan's A4 makes it so that anyone protected by her shield has an extra 15% physical damage bonus. And her C4 will shred physical resistance with the skill's initial hit. With these two, Xinyan's shield suddenly becomes a very valuable asset for any physical DPS. Running straight at an enemy to get a stronger shield is a lot more compelling when you also attach a debuff onto them. Plus, it gives Xinyan some support utility outside of just being a mediocre shield bot. Throwing Xinyan in as a 4th member of Phys team isn't a bad idea with these. Her support capabilities can actually add a pretty good amount of damage, especially if you run her with tenacity for extra damage buffs. She's an unusual support character, sure, but when run with a competent DPS, her boost can add up. Eula, Freminet, or even Xinyan. Oh yeah, let's get into DPS Xinyan. A lot of what makes Xinyan a good DPS is the same stuff that makes Eula a good DPS. Big numbers and juicy debuffs. Her normal attack scaling isn't quite as strong as Eula's, clocking in at 715% altogether at level 10, but that's not bad either. It's about what Ito has. The real appeal of Xinyan though is her burst. Similar to Eula, it's a single giant Phys hit with some added pyro after that. Again, while it's not as strong as Eula's, it's nothing to scoff at either, and has a few advantages of its own. Firstly, it's practically instant, coming out less than a second after pressing the button. Eula's 7-second buildup often leads to enemies moving out of the range of her burst or just dying before it goes off. You can cancel it early by switching off, but sometimes it just ends up missing through no fault of your own. While Xinyan's doesn't hit quite as hard, it's a lot more reliable. And speaking of reliability, let's go back to that C2. In addition to creating a shield when using her burst, the con also makes the big Phys hit of Xinyan's burst a guaranteed crit. This is actually a huge boon for Xinyan's damage, especially if you're just building around her burst. It lets you completely forego a balanced crit ratio to just stack crazy amounts of crit damage. If built properly, her burst becomes an extremely reliable, quick charging nuke that can take out or at least severely damage anything next to her. Paired with her shield damage swings, her C1 increases attack speed, and her legendary C6 that finally fixes her split scaling and makes her charge attack add some defense, Xinyan can become a fully competent DPS with the right investment, and an incredibly fun one at that. Xinyan is a unit who gets a lot of hate that I think is mostly undeserved. She has some very questionable design decisions, but also some really smart ones. If you build around the strengths her kit has, she can work as a solid support or a decently powerful DPS. I'll tell you right now that she won't be anywhere near as good as any of the modern DPS characters, and Eula's still probably better than her. But if you want to build her to have some off-meta fun and hit some big juicy Phys numbers, you will not be disappointed. For her upsides, her split supporter DPS build makes her a decent investment if you want to play a Phys character, whether it be her or someone else. She's a reliable heavy hitter who's a lot easier to play than Eula, and offers pretty similar results with proper investment. Plus, since she's a 4-star, and an old one, there's a really good chance you have her already, and probably some constellations on her. If you want to try a Phys character and don't have Eula, she's a decent replacement. However, Xinyan does have some pretty big cons too, and the first of these actually are her cons, as in constellations. A lot of Xinyan's potential is locked behind her C1, C6, C4, and especially C2. Every single one of her constellations, except 3, is a huge boost to her damage, and a few of them are basically required to get anywhere significant with her. There isn't any great simple way to get these, and she's not exactly a frequent flyer on recent banners, so it's really up to luck if you have these. Hell, I main her and I'm still missing 2 cons. That C6 especially I'd really like, because it'd fix her second issue, split scaling. It's a weird relic from the early days of Genshin's design, and unless Hexerai fixes that somehow, she's gonna be eternally stuck as this one or the other character. And on the topic of weird design, I cannot for the life of me figure out why she's Pyro. She can get Pyro Resonance easier, which is a really good one for Phys, but it mostly means that she can't proc Superconduct on her own, which basically forces her into exactly one team comp. Like, if they wanted to make her a Phys character and keep all for lore, make her Electro. Just give her electric guitar, it's that easy. Finally, she's still a physical character. It's not great. But you know what? I think it makes sense on her. Eula is the embodiment of physical, but Xinyan is the spirit of it. She's not afraid to go against the grain and the norm to do what she loves doing. It may be unusual, unconventional, and unpopular, but it's refreshing. It's got its own loyal fanbase, and most importantly, is what she loves doing. And that's rock and roll. Also, I swear I'm almost done with Xinyan, but I don't know when else I'm gonna talk about this. Her lore makes absolutely no sense. She's a Liyue resident with a southern accent, which presumably comes from Natlan, and she plays rock and roll, which apparently comes from Fontaine. Yet she seemingly has no connections with either of those. Also, her affiliation is listed as the Red Strings, which is a group that doesn't even have a wiki page, because it is never mentioned by anyone, including Xinyan herself. Who is this girl? 2.5 years. After Eula came out, there were no new dedicated physical characters for 2.5 years. It's strange, because it seemed like they had a good thing going with Eula. It seemed like the start of something great, but nothing. Throughout all of Inazuma and Sumeru, no new developments. But everything changed in Fontaine. A new character in the back half of version 4.0, Freminet was the third dedicated physical character, with a completely unique kit totally unlike the other two. By this time, Phys was already in a really bad state, for reasons we'll get to. But here comes a brand new character, and man, it was exciting. Was Freminet going to be the character who saves Phys? No. Freminet is, in my opinion, the worst designed physical character in the game. He's got some cool ideas, but more than a few things that hold him back. Let's break it down. I'll tell you right now, I'm not nearly as familiar with Frem as the other two characters I went over. This section will definitely be shorter, but I'll do my best to analyze him as thoroughly as possible. Freminet's main appeal is that he can actually fill two roles. He can be a cryo DPS or a physical one, entirely based on how you use the crux of his kit, his skill. When Freminet uses a skill, he'll get this meter that follows him around and gives him the ability to recast the skill, like Diluc. Every time he hits an enemy, the meter will go up one step, from 0 to 4. The thing is, the steps determine the ratio of elemental damage the skill does. At 0, it's all cryo, at 4, it's all physical, and everything in between is a mix of the two. For the sake of this video, I'm only going to be focusing on pure physical Frem, but just note the option for a marginally better cryo character is there. I already brought up Diluc as a comparison, but the Freminet gameplay loop is basically the same as his. Use your skill, weave in some normal attacks, and then use the skill again when your opponent has an element on them. Now, when I said that Freminet's kit was built around this skill, I really meant it. His burst, talented, all of his constellations are directly or indirectly built around buffing this skill. The most notable of these is his burst, which basically erases its cooldown and halves the number of hits required for a full charge, making him dish out damage much faster. With this being the core of his kit, Freminet stands out from his contemporaries as a combo character. The end goal of both Xinyan and Eula is to get one big juicy 6-digit hit of physical damage, but with Freminet, it's to keep hitting him with skill after skill to whittle them down. But his combos go deeper than that. His C4, C6, and A4 will all buff his damage after he triggers a reaction, either Freeze, Superconduct, or most interestingly, Shatter. His A4 in particular only triggers when he procs Shatter, which makes Freminet the only physical character built around actually triggering reactions. This means that unlike the other two, EM is actually a decently useful stat for Frem. The damage increase is negligible for Superconduct, as usual, but with Shatter's 3x multiplier, it can really pay off. This combo build also incentivizes a different style of team building, encouraging at least one Hydro character, and maybe even negating the need for Electro and Superconduct. Since a lot of physical teams fall into the same exact team comps, a Shatter team with a unit who can actually benefit from it is a nice breath of fresh air. Unfortunately, Freminet's new playstyle has a few drawbacks. For starters, let's talk about his actual performance. Freminet can do some really nice damage. Mine's pretty underleveled, but he can still get some extremely respectable numbers with his skill. When the conditions are right and he gets his buffs up, Freminet can be a great DPS. But there is a catch there. His combo-centric playstyle means he's missing a big delete your whole health bar move present on the other two, so he has to chip away the enemy through repeated skill usage. Without his buffs, this makes him take a lot longer to do anything. He's supposed to gain some extra damage through elemental reactions, but that has its own issues. He gets some really nice bonuses from proccing Freeze and Superconduct, but all those are locked behind his C4 and C6, so he runs into the same problem as Xinyan where he's just reliant on constellations. His biggest damage boost comes from his A4, but that requires him to proc Shatter, which, on top of a myriad of other problems, means he can't even trigger it against bosses. This is really terrible, since he's clearly meant to be a single target damage dealer, but can't even benefit from his biggest damage boost on the biggest single targets. Freminet is a strange case. To give him his proper recap, he does something really unique and interesting with physical, turning it into a more synergistic part of the game that works with the elements rather than alongside them is a really cool direction to take, and it makes him stand out a lot. Also, since he only requires his skill and maybe normal attacks, he's pretty simple to build and level up. Plus, his mix of cryo and physical damage makes him a lot more versatile than the other characters. It lets him overcome resistances in a pretty interesting way. It gives him a lot of freedom in how he's built. However, he also has a slew of problems. He lacks the nuke potential the other Phys characters have, and feels kinda weak as a result. His reaction-oriented kit makes him really want to proc Shatter, which is a horrible reaction that can't trigger against the guys you really want it to. It also means he may want to build some EM to capitalize on its massive multiplier. And if you don't want to build around Shatter, his other reaction buffs are locked behind his high constellations. And of course, he's still a physical unit, which just isn't where you want to be right now. I like Freminet. He's one of those characters I always want to build, but never get around to actually doing so. I really like the ideas he brought to the otherwise stagnant damage type. Remember, he was the first Phys DPS in 2.5 years, and he's unfortunately been the last one we've got. I feel like Frem was an experiment by the developers. They had an interesting idea to make physical fit more with the rest of the game by building it around reactions and making it fit in more with the core systems. It feels like they were supposed to follow up a few months later with another Phys combo character, but just never did. If Eula is the embodiment of Phys, and Xinyan is the spirit of it, Freminet represents the current state of the non-element. While its siblings dance around in the spotlight, physical isn't even in the theater. Quiet, isolated, and alone at the bottom of the sea. Before we switch to support, I want to briefly go over some off-meta characters. Ones who weren't designed to be Phys DPSs, but can work to some extent for whatever reason. These will be much briefer than the full breakdowns I just did, don't worry. Firstly, Razor. Some of you may be surprised I haven't mentioned him yet. Razor, on the surface, seems like a premier Phys character, and he used to be way back when. He's a greatsword, he's electro, and he's the only person in the game to have a physical bonus ascension stat. And while those are good traits, there's also all he has going for him. Every part of his kit leans a lot more into his electro damage, specifically Quicken or Electro Charge. It doesn't benefit his physical at all. He can trigger Superconduct very easily, but he doesn't benefit from it as much as some other characters. Recently, he also got buffs from Hexride that turned him into a phenomenal electro DPS. I was able to beat floor 12 for the first time thanks to him, and it wasn't for his physical damage. He's sort of like Freminet actually, where he can work as either an electro or physical DPS, but with Razor, it's more of electro with a side of physical. I am super glad that Razor's viable again. He was my first real main, and it makes me so happy that he's making use of all the investment I gave him way back when. But for better or for worse, new Razor is focused substantially more on electro. Up next we've got the Geo Bros. Pyke Lee is probably the face of unintended Phys characters, and I can see why. As the name suggests, it's a Zhongli built around the Crescent Pike, a craftable weapon with a Phys bonus second stat, and a weird bonus that basically fires off a second Phys hit on every attack while it's active. Pair this with Zhongli's multi-hits, his Pillar Shield, and the Universal Red Shred, and it's not hard to see why this one took off. I don't have him, as you can see, so I can't comment on how well he does from personal experience, but if I had Zhongli, you'd better believe I'd have a second build just for this. Sadly, it does come at the cost of the best shield in the game, so I can't fully recommend it as an investment, but definitely as a fun off build. Fortunately, our next character doesn't have such issues. Gorou may seem like a really weird character to bring up in this video, but I assure you, there is a good reason for him being here. So, there's this absolutely insane tech known simply as Machine Gun Gorou. For some reason, Gorou's normal attack comes out near instantly when you press the button, even if you cancel the animation. So, if you alternate between shooting and aiming charge shots, he theoretically fires as fast as you can press the buttons. This turns the dedicated Geo support into a surprisingly competent DPS. With the right weapons, teams, and talent levels, and some practice, you can dish out some weirdly high damage in the funniest way possible. And for some reason, it only works on Gorou, and is the only thing in the game that actually works better on controller. If you want to play this, I'd highly recommend Fischl and Yunjin, since they both have abilities that trigger on every hit with no cooldown. Plus, they set up Superconduct and Geo Resonance, which is one of the best for Phys characters. Unlike the other honorable mention characters, there's basically no opportunity cost here. Gorou is a very niche unit who only works in specific Geo teams, and over time has gotten some decent replacements in those teams. There's no harm in investing in this and letting Kachina take a spot for a while. Also, his best in slot artifact set is one that nobody else in the game wants. I seriously can't recommend this enough. If you want to do something really fun and really stupid with a character you're barely using, this is right up your alley, with 3 small caveats. Watch a video on it, get a controller, and play it in short bursts. It deserves a mention in this video because it's the only build that can do physical damage to you, the player. Finally, the last honorable mention Phys character is anyone. I mean it. Genshin is a game with a ton of different characters, artifacts, weapons, and it encourages you to try to mix them together in unusual ways. 80% of the characters in the game have a string of normal attacks to do physical damage. Why not build around that? A while back I got C6 Kirara. I don't need Kirara at all, since I've got Baizu, so I just threw her aside for a long time. But recently, I decided to try turning her into a really bizarre DPS by pairing her strong shield with Calamity of Eshu and retracing Bolide. And you know what? It kinda works. She's pretty underleveled right now. With all those damage bonuses stacking on top of each other, she got to get some pretty respectable damage out. Now, these characters obviously won't beat floor 12 for you, but they can be an interesting way to use a character that you otherwise wouldn't. and it leans into a perk of physical I'll get to later. I've seen multiple people out there running DPS Mika. When I say that any character can work for this, I really mean it. Speaking of Mika, it's finally time to look at the flip side of physical, the supports. If you thought the DPS options for Phys were limited, prepare to be blown away by the one dedicated physical support. Mika is a very odd character. He released in the middle of Sumeru version 3.5 with basically no fanfare. It's such a weird time to drop him. He was the only Mondstack character between Eula and Dahlia, as one of the few 4-stars in recent years not to come out alongside a character they're built for, instead debuting with Dia. Weird. Anyways, Mika is a full support character who launched with very lukewarm reception. He was sort of just seen as a worse Bennett and quickly disregarded. He's had a pretty decent resurgence in recent years thanks to Freminet, but he's still widely regarded as a niche unit who's good at buffing the worst damage type. Now, personally, I love Mika. I think he's one of the best support units in the game, genuinely top 5. He has a unique role that he fills well, and I find myself using him in a ton of different teams. Funnily enough, barely any of that is actually because of his physical buffs. Honestly, that's the least useful part of his kit. Let's break it down and see why. Mika does 3 things as a support: heal, buff attack speed, and buff Phys. Let's start with his healing. When Mika uses his burst, the entire team will be healed a really good amount, and then your on-field character will get a small burst of healing when they land a normal attack. It's a phenomenal source of healing, easily gets Freminet a ton of fanfare, and synergizes great with Noblesse. There aren't many sources of team-wide healing in the game, and even fewer that restore this much this fast. Paired with the constant healing from normal attacks, it's pretty hard to die when you have Mika on your team. But the most interesting part of his kit is his skill. When Mika casts his skill, even if it doesn't hit anything, it'll boost the team's attack speed. Attack speed is one of the rarest stats to mess with in the game. There's a very small handful of characters who buff it, and most of those are just DPS characters who want the buffs for themselves. Mika is not only the easiest source of it, but the biggest source of it. At max talent level, he boosts it by a whopping 25%, which is the difference you can really feel. Mika's free attack speed buff for any DPS you want is his main selling point. It gives him a unique role to stand out from the crowd of other supports, and when paired with his great healing, he feels like a great side grade to Bennett. Less extra damage per attacks, but more attacks, and more consistent healing. Oh yeah, and he also buffs physical, I guess. I feel like people overstate Mika's Phys synergy. A lot of the time when he's disregarded, it's because people write him off as the Phys buffer, and because Phys is bad, he's bad. This is hardly true, in both directions. Mika's a great support without physical, and physical doesn't actually rely on him. Mika's physical support is actually a very small part of his kit, and easily the worst designed part of it. When he uses his skill, you either have it pierce enemies in a line or bounce between enemies. For every enemy it hits, you'll get 1 shard. Each shard you get will increase the team's Phys damage. The problem with this is the same problem that Xinyan has with her shield. Its effectiveness is entirely reliant on the number of enemies in an area. There's potential for a massive 40 or even 50% damage boost, but against the enemies you really want that against, you're only getting 10, and even that's only assuming you have a C2. Speaking of, Mika's C6 actually elevates him to the premier Phys support. It adds another maximum stack to his shards, which is pretty meaningless, but then it also increases your team's physical crit damage by a colossal 60%. This alone is enough to make him the go-to pick for physical teams, and justifies him being classified as the Phys support guy. Still, even if he's a good support for physical, he's not the support it really needs. Mika doesn't solve any of the core issues with physical the way a character like a Escoffier did with Freminet. He sort of just put a band-aid on a flesh wound. As a whole, Mika is a very potent support character that I think a lot of people vastly underestimate. His attack speed bonus alone makes him worth investing in. It's a really unique buff that helps him stand out from the competition. When paired with his phenomenal healing, he becomes an extremely strong support character for both offense and defense, and can legitimately be preferred to Bennett in some situations. And similar to Benny, he's a pretty low investment character. Noblesse artifacts, 1, maybe 2 talents to invest in, and an HP spear. I use my Mika in like 5 different teams, and he sells a level 4 artifact. His physical bonuses, however jank they may be, are helpful and can help the team's damage output, especially at C6. And lastly, being cryo is always pretty useful. Unfortunately, Mika has a fair share of downsides of his own. I've already talked about his extremely weird damage bonus, but I haven't talked about his miserable elemental application. He gets one instance of it from a skill with an 18-second cooldown, and that's it. That one instance is fortunately enough for Superconduct, but if you want a consistent cryo applier in a team, you'll need to look elsewhere. Like a few other characters we've looked at, a lot of his potential is locked behind constellations. Mika doesn't have a bad con to his name, they're all 100% worth picking up, but until you get to C6, he doesn't really become the physical support he's advertised to be. Finally, while he does help physical a lot, especially at C6, he doesn't solve it. He boosts the damage a good amount, sure, but not enough to make it a viable damage type. I think that's the biggest reason why people sleep on Mika. He was advertised as a physical support, and because he was the first attention physical gotten over a year, people thought that he was gonna be the thing that finally made it good again. But he wasn't. Funny thing is, he's not even that great with the physical characters. Eula, absolutely. He's built around her in particular, and it shows. That attack speed buff lets you get plenty more stacks for bursting, and cryo resonance is great. But Freminet I feel is built a lot more around a rhythm set in place by his normal attacks, and Xinyan prefers Bennett, at least until Mika C6. Like Freminet, Mika feels like an experiment. Maybe there was supposed to be another, more dedicated character after him, but clearly that never happened. As such, he remains the only dedicated physical support character in the game, and he's not even good at that. Like with the DPS, there are a few other characters I want to discuss real quick as other support options, even if it's not their intended role. The first of these is Rosaria, who's actually a way better physical support than Mika. Everything Rosaria does is a great benefit to physical teams. Obviously, she's cryo, which not only enables Superconduct, but helps with cryo resonance. And unlike Mika, she offers a constant source of cryo application, especially since her burst has no ICD, making it way easier to capitalize on cryo resonance. To add on to that, her A4 will boost the party's crit rate by upwards of 15%, a very simple and tremendously helpful boost. Finally, her C6 will just shred Phys res. If you want to play Phys, you want to build Rosaria. She feels tailor-made around supporting it, much more so than Mika. Plus, building her as a support offers some really interesting artifact combos. I'm currently running 2-piece Emblem and 2-piece Berserker on her. Would absolutely recommend. She is a staple in physical teams for a very good reason. Another support you've probably been noticing be used throughout this video is Raiden. Raiden is a very interesting case, because she's traditionally played as a DPS, and I think that's what most people know her for, but she actually has some amazing support potential, and on the same way that Gorou has DPS potential, she's a lot simpler. All of Raiden's support capabilities come from her skill, which provides a laundry list of extremely useful benefits. While active, Raiden's skill will periodically do linked attacks with your active character, providing electro application, and, by extension, easy Superconduct procs. It hits fast enough to maintain complete uptime on tenacity, effectively giving an extra free damage boost to your DPS. And while it's active, your character's burst damage will be massively increased based on the cost of their burst. Since 2 of the Phys DPS characters are burst nukes, you can understand why this is massively helpful. While support Raiden is built around her skill, her burst is also pretty good as a filler way to get some extra damage and energy. Once you've finished up your rotation, switch back to her, pop your burst, and just like that, the rest of your team has all of their energy back. Support Raiden may be a slightly unconventional way to build her, but honestly, I've been playing her as a support more than I have as a DPS. She works great, and physical teams take full advantage of all of her benefits. Her one downside is that she provides so much electro that you won't really be able to capitalize on cryo resonance, but considering all the benefits she provides, it is well worth it sometimes. The next and final character I want to cover is Yunjin. There are some other good supports, but they're all the standard selection. I don't need to tell you that Bennett or Zhongli is a good character to use, but Yunjin, I might. Yun is a character who I think a lot of people just forget is in the game, and unlike Mika, I can't blame them too much. She is a really weird character who's a good addition to a small number of builds. Fortunately, physical builds happen to be some of those few. Yun's main gimmick is adding a flat damage bonus onto every attack during her burst duration. Since physical can't trigger reactions, it's entirely reliant on larger numbers per hit. Having a source of that outside of res shred and damage bonuses is very helpful, so Yun finds a nice spot in some Phys teams. She doesn't fit into everyone quite as easily as Rosaria, however. Trying to fit a random Geo support character into a team like this can be really tough. She is never worth bringing over Superconduct, and a lot of times, a resonance is generally more useful than a situational bit of extra damage. If you have a 4th slot open though, she's a pretty good fit, especially if your DPS is already Geo. But even then, she runs into a weird problem of artifact choice. Noblesse seems like the best choice for her, but it's also Benny and Mika's best options, and Physical can't benefit from something like Archaic Petra. Husk is a decent option, but still leaves her with her other problem of horrible ER requirements. Even with an ER Sans and Favonius, she's going to need all the extra energy you can muster, and depending on the DPS, that can end up just being a detriment. Despite her drawbacks, I like Yoon. She's a fun character, and while she's not a great fit in every Physical team, she slides very nicely into a few of them. That just about covers every single Physical character in the game. I know this was a long ramble that probably took up most of the video, but it's arguably the most important part. In Genshin, a damage type or element is only as good as its characters. Burning isn't a good reaction because it's burning, it's because it has characters who use its advantages and make it good. Electrocharge isn't one of the best reactions right now because it's Electrocharge, it's because it has like 6 characters dedicated to making it good. Team comps in this game need external support to stay relevant. They need new characters to freshen things up for the current meta. Just look at Geo. It's been stuck in this loop of being completely irrelevant, then suddenly getting a tremendous boost to make it amazing, and then gradually sinking back into irrelevancy as the devs forget about it to buff Hydro more. Physical is in a similar situation, except it never got that boost. Physical peaked back in version 1.5 with Eula, because that was the last time it got a real meta-shaping character. There have been a few experiments since then, sure, but there hasn't been a real must-have in nearly 5 years. This leads well into the second core issue with Physical, a lack of character variety. I said it at the start of this section, but there are only 3 Physical DPS characters. 3. For reference, there are 10 for Pyro, and that's only counting the on-fielders. You may have noticed throughout this section, but I never once mentioned a sub-DPS character. That's because there just isn't one for Physical. Every single Phys character needs to be on-field to get anything done, which adds to the annoying problem of every Phys team feeling basically identical, and also locks it out of being a supporting option for other teams. It's not like Burning, Catalyze, or Electrocharge, where you can run it as a secondary source of damage with a different reaction or element. When you run a Phys team, that's it. You can't realistically pair it with any other damage type, since it just demands too much. An off-fielder could solve this really well, and so could a Superconduct buff to make it a decent reaction on its own. But as it stands, Physical is an isolated, on-field only damage type. And even looking past that, there's only one support who's built to help Phys, and he's not even good at that until his last constellation. Plus, with how long it's been since Freminet, Physical players like myself have been stuck with the same things for way too long. It's not like the elements, where once you get bored of a DPS, another one drops, better than the last, and gives you something new to play around with. We've been stuck rotating between the same few characters for the past 2.5 years. While we're stuck down here, everything else has just been getting better and better, adapting to an ever-changing meta that Physical just isn't allowed to be a part of. That leads nicely into the last major issue with Physical: neglect. Superconduct is weak, and there's a devastatingly small amount of Physical characters. Those are big issues, but they are not the biggest issue. Those are not why Physical is the worst damage type in the game. No, the real reason is something far deeper. The devs are leaving Physical out of the meta by not letting it benefit from modern characters. Let me explain. Since the game's release, Physical has always been left out of some buffs. VV can't work on it, Archaic can't work on it, and EM has always been a complete waste. But despite this, there are some characters or mechanics that did help it out. Zhongli's pillars are the best example. The universal res shred they're famous for does include Physical, but as the game has gone on, it's just been included in less and less otherwise universal buffs. The first big example of this was right at the start of version 5. As with every new region, we got some new artifacts, and these ones were extremely strong. Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City is arguably the best artifact set in the entire game, and it's not hard to see why. When the holder triggers a reaction, it'll boost the damage of the elements involved in the reaction by 12%, which then jumps to a massive 40% if the holder is from Natlan. This is a stupendously good buff. But since it only buffs elements involved in a reaction, Physical can't reap its benefits. Or can it? Obviously, Physical wouldn't benefit from Superconduct here, since that's Cryo and Electro. But it can trigger Shatter. Is this the solution to making Shatter useful? give it the niche of being able to trigger scroll for Phys? Is this finally Freminet's time to shine? No. The devs just deliberately made sure that Shatter doesn't trigger the effect. Great. This alone sentenced Physical to complete irrelevance for all of version 5, since it just couldn't compete with anything else without that phenomenal buff. Even Geo, the element known for having exactly one extremely terrible reaction, still ended up being amazing solely because that crappy reaction still lets it benefit from scroll. I mean, the free character they give you to try it out is a Geo character. But maybe that's not a fair comparison, since that isn't the only extremely strong thing Geo got in early version 5. Xilonen dropped in version 5.1, as she was one of the most powerful support characters the game had seen yet. On top of some decent healing and being a fantastic holder of scroll, she could shred the resistance of nearly every damage type in the game. Specifically, all of them that could cause crystallize. So, everything except Anemo, Dendro, and Physical. Anemo had Farazan, that was fine. Dendro did get hurt by this, but there were enough specialized Dendro units that it was still doing alright. But Physical? Just kicking it while it's already down. It could be argued that it doesn't need Xilonen because Superconduct already shreds res about the same amount, but that ignores the other amazing benefits Xilonen provides, and also the fact that 4 of the elements she buffs can benefit from VV. The rest of Natlan was not kinda physical. Near the end of version 5, Freeze, a questionably viable cryo reaction, got 2 separate characters dedicated to making it amazing in combat, even against bosses, which was previously its biggest weakness. If you thought that a Freeze buff was going to do anything for Shatter, you'd be wrong. It was completely forgotten by both Escoffier and Skirk. Worse yet, Cryo, specifically its reactions, had been getting a lot of attention during version 5. Dedicated Freeze characters, dedicated Melt characters, dedicated Crystallize characters. Every single Cryo reaction at this point was amazing. Except Superconduct. The only thing it got was a minute scaling buff, but every Electro reaction got that. It didn't help to make it any better of a reaction, it just left it in basically the same state it was before. Version 5 was notable for Physical. It was the first entire version where absolutely nothing new was released for the non-element. No mediocre DPS or experimental support or even a weapon. They didn't even try to do anything with Physical. While they were focused on buffing the underused and overlooked reactions, they failed to give any buffs to the part of combat that needs it most. Fortunately, things were actually looking up for Nodcry. Right at the end of version 5, we got introduced to Lunar reactions, which were massive buffs to certain reactions to give them new life in the meta. They started with Electrocharge because they were obsessed with buffing Electrocharge in version 5, but there was potential here. Maybe Lunarconduct would be the thing that saves Physical. This was my mindset for the early chapters of Nodcry, keeping my hopes up for it. They neglected Phys in version 5 because they were going to do something really nice with it in Luna. Of course, nothing could dampen my hopeful optimism. Until something did. Or rather, someone. Durin is a very recent character who has already found a nice place in the meta. He's a support DPS hybrid who functions quite similarly to Xilonen in that he provides massive damage swings for almost everything in the game. He has 2 different stances he can trigger, which buff different damage types. One of them is a colossal boost to melt and vape damage, so Cryo and Hydro, and the other is a res shred for Pyro, Electro, Dendro, Geo, and Anemo. Notice anything missing there? Durin just explicitly excludes Physical. Gone are the day of Zhongli's universal res shred. Now we're in the world of everything but Physical res shred. And if that wasn't enough, Lunar Crystallize got added soon after, which only triggers between Hydro and Geo. Considering the other 2 Lunar reactions, it seems like these may only be buffs to Hydro reactions, so Lunarconduct might be an impossibility. And as of the point of writing this script, that brings us to the current state of Physical, which is inarguably its worst ever. For about 2 years now, every type of elemental damage has been getting a steady flow of characters, artifacts, or universal buffs to keep them relevant. Even Geo, which for a long time has been seen as the worst element, has shot up to the top recently with a series of great characters to fix up its issues. Physical, however, has been left to rot. It's not even that it hasn't gotten attention from the devs, it's being intentionally ignored and left out. While it may not be as flashy or dynamic as the elements, Physical has its own set of perks to help it stand out from them. unique traits that only it can possibly have, and that I don't want to be forgotten. Let's break them down. Physical, being non-elemental, is the universal damage type. While this obviously means that 80% of the cast has a physical attack string, it means that there's unique things that can be done with that physical string. No enemy in the game is immune to physical. This may sound like a weird thing to point out, but it is a good strength. Every other damage type is elemental. Elemental damage doesn't work against enemies of the same element. Slimes, specters, frost scions, hypostasi, and all sorts of random other enemies are completely immune to a certain damage type, and most of them have a variant in every element. Physical completely bypasses this, making it an extremely reliable damage type for most situations. This can be useful in Abyss if there's a lot of enemies that are immune to different damage types, in Domains as a quick go-to selection if you're jumping between a bunch of them, or for overworld exploration if you're grinding a bunch of one enemy with an innate resistance or immunity. Specters are the most notable case of this, since they are extremely obnoxious enemies with valuable drops that can be completely immune to your main damage element, making them even more annoying to kill. I know the title of best Spectre farming damage in the game doesn't sound all that impressive, but it makes the process so much easier. This is also where Freminet's split damage can come in handy. He can basically swap from a physical DPS to a cryo one or vice versa on the fly. He'll absolutely be better at one than the other, but if you haven't built enough, he should be decent at both. Cryo enemy, pull out physical. Physical resisting enemy, pull out cryo. It's awesome. That brings up another strength and weakness of Phys, resistances. Damage resistances are stats the game annoyingly hides from you that determine how effective a damage type is against an enemy. Most of them are pretty easy to figure out, like obviously the rock guys who can resist Geo, but physical resistances are wild. All Ruin enemies have an innate 50 to 70% physical res. While this is really annoying, I see why they put it in. They're basically Physical's version of a slime, but being an unnatural damage type, they had to get an equally unnatural enemy to counter it. I really wish they would stop putting these guys in Abyss as much as they still do, but that's beside the point. There are some other annoying enemies with innately higher Phys res, Lolaturls, Minotaurs, Serpent Knights, and Regisvines to name a few. It isn't as high as Ruin enemies, but still makes them more obnoxious to kill. I don't know why they feel the need to make things harder to kill with what's already the hardest damage type to kill anything with, but whatever. The cool thing is, this is a two-sided interaction. While there are some enemies with a higher built-in Phys res, there are also some with a lower one, and a lot of them. Notably, every humanoid enemy has an abysmal negative 20% physical resistance, and this has stayed persistent throughout the entire game. Treasure hoarders, samurai, eremites, tribal warriors, and every single Fatui are naturally weak to physical. I've seen some people write this off as an insignificant bonus to the non-element, but I'd strongly disagree. When you're fighting these guys with physical, you can really feel that extra damage. It is not a small difference. While most of them may be weak enemies, that doesn't make it a useless bonus. For starters, not all of them are weak fodder enemies. Fatui agents, eremite summoners, mirror maidens, Sisson mages, Karagi, and most recently, all of the high-ranking Fatui from Nodcry are enemies they can find alone in Abyss floors. With that negative resistance, it can be well worth it to bring a physical team in to kill them quickly. Additionally, the enemies who are filler scrubs can pretty frequently be found in massive clumps on some Abyss floors or Imaginarium stages. Considering that 2 of the physical DPS characters are designed to drop a 6-digit damage number on everything remotely close to them, they can clear out the groups pretty fast. But no matter how nice those perks are, they're just not enough to compete with whatever hijinks the elemental damage types are doing in current day. Those may have been enough to make it viable back in version 1 and 2, but we are long past those days. As the game marches ever onward and the meta keeps shifting around, physical is never a part of it. But why? I mean, I've already explained why, but why? Why do the devs refuse to give it any help? They've gone out of the way to buff every other underpowered damage type multiple times, but just haven't bothered to do a single thing with physical. Did they genuinely just forget about it? It's hard to say since we can never tell what the Hoyo team is thinking, but I have a pretty good idea in this case. I personally believe that physical is being intentionally neglected by the developers for one simple reason. They're ashamed of it. Think back to the very start of this video, and that little blurb I read off the official website. Master of the 7 elements, Genshin isn't just another mindless hack and slash. Physical, in its current state, goes completely against this statement. A lot of the physical gameplay is just mashing the attack button to swing your sword at things, and using the rest of the characters in your party to just make you better at doing that. It directly goes against one of the fundamental designs of the game, which is why the devs have just silently swept it under the rug. This is a solution, sure, but leaves a chunk of the combat mechanics they've already set up to just be weird leftovers that don't fit in with anything else. If they don't like how physical is now, rather than ignoring it, they should change it entirely. Character kits have only gotten more unique and creative over the years, especially in Nodcry, so there is no good reason they couldn't spare some creative juices for a few characters to overhaul physical, or at least bring new life to the damage type. While working on this video, I came up with a few ideas of my own for potential kits. I want to throw them out there as theoretical ways to fix physical. Maybe if I'm lucky, some random internet hoyo will see this, and we can see some change happen. Who knows? First, let's recap the strengths and weaknesses of physical so we know what to target when designing a new character. Firstly, weaknesses to patch up. Physical is reliant on Superconduct, which is a reaction that has been left intentionally underpowered. There is a crippling lack of character variety, consisting of 3 on-fielders and technically 1 support. And all recent universal buffs have deliberately excluded physical. For strengths to lean into, physical has naturally higher multipliers and scaling than any elemental damage, is the most accessible damage type in the game, and the only one that nothing is immune to, and all humanoid enemies are inherently weak to it. We can just ignore that last strength because it's not super relevant here. If we want to make a character to actually make some use of physical in the modern day, they need to overcome or manipulate multiple of those weaknesses, and ideally lean into the strengths to make them stand out as a good representation of the damage type. I've got 2 ideas I'd like to discuss that I think meet those criteria pretty well. But before we get to those, I want to mention what I think will be the next step for physical. Eula. Again. We were recently introduced to Hexerai, a mechanic that takes old, outdated characters, and Fischl, and massively buffs their kits to make them viable in the current day. Hexerai has done wonders for the characters it's applied to, and since Varka, the newest character at the time of writing, is also a Hex character, it seems like they're just gonna keep adding to it. We haven't gotten any more old characters with Hex buffs yet, but it's only a matter of time. Since they seem to be focusing solely on Mondstadt characters for now, sooner or later they're gonna have to get to Eula. It's going to be very interesting when they do, because it'll force the devs to do something with physical. I don't want to make any predictions or anything, since Hexerai can do some absolutely crazy out of left field things with its characters, but I really hope they learn some stuff from Freminet and make it mix with the rest of the mechanics more. More importantly, whatever they do with Eula, I hope it's something they'll do more of in the future. I don't want another Frem situation, where they start doing something really cool with physical, and then just don't bother to expand on it. When they do get around to revamping Eula, I seriously hope it'll be the start of a new age for physical, but only time will tell. Anyways, back to business. I don't know what they're gonna do with Eula, but I have some ideas they could do with other characters. The first of these character ideas takes inspiration from Freminet and focuses more on those weaknesses, and actually targets all 3 of them really well in one easy way: Lunarconduct. Superconduct has a lot more potential than the devs are using it for. It is the debuffing reaction. I know Swirl gets a lot of credit for doing that, but that's only through Viridus and Venerer. Superconduct gets it built in. If we want to give the reaction more of an identity, we need to lean into that. And here's what I'm proposing. I want Superconduct to still be the physical reaction. I think it has a nice role as that, but I want it to be useful outside of that as well. While every single damage type can get Res Shred easily these days, Def Shred is still an extremely scarce debuff. Giving Superconduct some amount of Def Shred would turn into a universally useful debuff option for all sorts of team comps, especially with Res Shred becoming increasingly common. On top of that, I'd bump up the Phys Shred. If physical isn't allowed to play with any new toys, it should get better with the ones it does have. Since this is Lunarconduct, it needs some lunar reaction scaling shenanigans, but I've got a neat idea for that. Every lunar reaction takes all of your stats into account to increase damage, but what if Lunarconduct instead turned it into increased debuff scaling? By default, it'd be the same as Superconduct now, 0 defense and 40 Phys res. But the more invested your characters, the more to cripple the enemy. Obviously there'd be some sort of cap on this, and it'd be very hard to reach. I'd say 30% for defense and 80% for Phys res. Is that a ludicrously high amount for Phys? Yeah, but it's also about the damage swings G-Loading gives, so I'd say we roll with it. Superconduct is supposed to be the reaction to cripple enemies and make them more vulnerable, and I think this would be a fun way to mix it in with the modern systems. Oh, and I've got one more idea for it. When Superconduct procs, it releases this big explosion of cryo. Make that physical. That way, the main benefit isn't lost on teams that aren't fully built around physical, and it's finally a source of off-field Phys damage. Now, I don't have any idea what the actual kit for this character would look like. They have to be either cryo or electro, probably the former, and they need some sort of off-field application. Considering that Superconduct is a support reaction, maybe they'd be a support character who also heals. As for an actual character to wield Lunarconduct, my first choice was the Doctor. He's a madman who loves nothing more than experimentation and has willingly and mercilessly ruined the lives of countless people. If there's anyone who's gonna be triggering reactions to utterly debilitate the enemy, it'd be him. However, after certain events, I may have to rethink that casting. Either way, the chances of Lunarconduct ever happening in any form are looking dubious, since lunar reactions seem to be tied to Hydro. But that's alright, just rename it and slap it on someone else. Or if you want, do away with the complicated scaling, tie it to a talent level, and throw it onto a Chevreuse type character as a Superconduct buffer. Either way, I like this idea a lot. Superconduct and Physical are currently stuck in this awkward circle of keeping each other down, but this would let Superconduct finally be free of its chains, while also greatly improving Physical with it. As much as I like this idea though, I gotta say, my next one's a lot more interesting. This kit would lean a lot more into physical strengths. Like, a lot more. Here's what I'm thinking. So, this character's skill would be a pretty standard albedo type thing. Place down a summon, and then it periodically deal damage to nearby enemies. Physical, of course. As it did that though, the character would gradually accumulate these stacks. I'm thinking they get one or so every time it hits something, and then could also gain them through characters doing normal attacks on the enemy the summon is targeting. As these stacks accumulate, the summon would start shredding res based on how many it had. Not just for Phys, but for the element the on-field character is hitting the enemy with too. It wouldn't be a huge amount of res shred, but damage boost is a damage boost. For their burst, the character would recall the summon, and then deal a huge nuke of physical damage to everything around them, with the damage and AoE scaling upward based on the number of stacks it accumulated. Basically, they're an off-field quick swap Eula albedo hybrid, which is where I got the idea from. I use albedo a lot more than most, just because my build for him is absolutely nuts. If I have a 4th team slot and nobody to fill it with, he's usually my go-to. It's free damage that doesn't interfere with reactions nor trigger any of its own, and I think that's exactly what a physical sub-DPS should offer. The stacks I think go a long way to make the character interesting. I mean, they're the main reason Eula is so fun to play. Well, that and. The stacks are a mechanically interesting give and take, where they shred res for your character's elements, so long as you meet the basic requirement of doing normal attacks. I went with normal attacks because I feel like they're an important part of the physical identity. They give the character some extremely good synergizes, and also to benefit from attack speed buffs like Mika. Plus, it keeps the most fun part of Eula, trying to squeeze in as many hits as possible for the burst's big hit. To go further into the burst idea, I think the skill should have a timer like Oz, maybe around 15 seconds, and if the character returned to the field before the timer was up, they'd absorb it into the burst and increase its damage and AoE based on the stacks it accumulated. It gives them a really interesting role in how they fit into rotations. If you switch back and bursted too early, you'd be missing out on some potential damage, but if you switch back too late, the summon would be gone and the burst wouldn't do very much. It's a pretty fun idea if I do say so myself. As cool as that skill and burst are, I haven't actually gotten to the main gimmick of the character yet. You may have noticed that both their skill and burst deal solely physical damage, and if so, I'm sure you're trying to think of what element they'd be. And that's just the thing, they wouldn't have an element. Much like the unaligned traveler, this character would be solely physical. However, this would have its own unique perks. I think that characters like Chevreuse and Escoffier, who check the party's elemental composition and give buffs accordingly, would include this character as a false positive of sorts. While they wouldn't be able to benefit from the team's general buffs most of the time, they'd be an extremely reliable source of off-field damage and could be very useful for overcoming resistances. Now, I'm not exactly sure how this non-elemental thing would work for resonance, particles, or imaginarium, but that goes beyond the scope of what I want to talk about right now. The idea of this kit as a whole is to lean into and fully embrace Phys as the universal damage type. It's not always the best option for a team, but it is always an option. I think getting an off-field sub-DPS is what the damage type needs more than anything else. And pairing that with the extremely damaging nukes that DPSs are known for would spark new interest in physical in a way that I think the devs would like a lot. Now, as for a character to stick the kit to, I actually have a pretty good choice for this one too. Piero. Piero is a surviving Conrian who has teamed up with the Tsaritsa to go against the gods in everything they stand for. Conria is a nation without a god, and as such, the one without an element, and since visions are gifts from the gods, I don't think Pyro would use one, even if he has one. While he could use a delusion, and he no doubt has access to a massive supply of those, I think it'd be a really cool demonstration of his own power if he went onto the battlefield with nothing but his raw abilities. Plus, he was once a sage in Conria, so summoning a little helper seems well within his abilities. All in all, I think that some variation of this kit is what I'd like to see most in the game. They can change anything they want in it, just as long as an off-field physical character exists in the game, it'll do more for the damage type than anything else they could possibly do. Those are just my two ideas. A character who leans into Superconduct's debuffing abilities, and off-field sub-DPS with some Eula mechanics. I designed them both to lean into different strengths of physical, and to cover different weaknesses. But those are just the ones I came up with passively. However, I am very interested in hearing any ideas you might have. How would you design a new physical character? I feel like there's a lot of potential ways to take a damage type as dormant as physical and spice it up. Lean into old philosophies, embrace the new ones, the sky's the limit. That's why I'm seriously curious to hear other people's thoughts. What do you do? I remember back when Skirk got teased, some people thought she'd be the first fully physical character. It makes sense for a person who literally comes from outside the place where the elements have any control. But nope, she just ended up being a generic freeze DPS. What a waste. We still need an off-field physical character, and it wouldn't be hard to make one. That's not the only thing Phys needs, but I'd argue that's the most important, and it'd be a good start towards fixing it. If I haven't made it clear throughout this video, I am a big fan of physical damage. While it may not be as flashy or mechanically interesting as the elements, there's something immensely satisfying about taking down giant monsters using nothing but your sword and a bottom 3 reaction. Physical is a fun gimmick right now, but I really wish it was something more. It was good once upon a time, maybe even great, but it has fallen completely to the wayside nowadays. While I could list all the fundamental problems with why that is because of A, B, and C, the truth is, it's all for one reason. That's because the devs haven't bothered to do anything with it. As long as Hoyo refuses to touch physical, it's going to be stuck in this state and just get worse over time. In the end, they are the only ones with the power to do anything, and they're just refusing to. I've been praying for some sort of physical buff for years now, and we've still gotten nothing. I'm predicting that if they do remember physical exists one day, the path to fixing it is going to start with Superconduct. It is a massive outlier, it's one of the only reactions without a dedicated character, and they seem to be working their way through all of those, even the ones that really don't need it. Since Nautocry seems to be about Hydro, Snedge seems like the place where a Phys change would happen. Cryo is deeply integrated into physical gameplay already, so it only seems natural. I really hate seeing Phys in the state it's in now. The DPS characters, try as I might, just can't compete with any sort of reaction-based team. Even though it's not as complicated as the elemental damage types, physical is a very unique part of the game, hence why I just talked about it for an hour. I wouldn't be making this video if I wasn't passionate about it, and I truly am. It scales in such a different way, making use of its lack of reactions. It has an innate advantage over a whole section of enemies. It's a universally reliable option against everything in the game. It has a fun set of DPS characters who all try to utilize its different strengths. It's the only damage type with weapon substats. There's so much good stuff that physical has going for it that makes it truly unique from the 7 elements. But unfortunately, Hoyo just isn't bothering to embrace those, and it's just writing it off in the same way that most of the fanbase has. It's the boring mash B damage type. You know, it's kind of funny when you think about it. Physical used to be a strong, prosperous damage type that was doing its own thing, separate from the elements, until the great higher-ups just decided that its time was done, and abandoned it to rot while they focused on the elements instead. Doesn't that sound, I don't know, just a little bit familiar? Anyways, that's all I've got for you. Thanks for watching, thanks for 1,000 subscribers, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.